A very good afternoon to all and a warm welcome. Myself, Dr. Ajit Kolatkar, I'll be the moderator for today's session. I am the founder director of GastroLab, which is India's first GI and liver disorder focused diagnostic research company. And today we are going to try and understand whether a non-endoscopic based assessment of stomach is possible and whether a non-invasive tool could help us better understand the stomach disorders. So stomach, as we know, traditionally is known to be a hollow muscular sac with its primary function or the capability being digestion, which is enabled by two important functions, which is a secretory function and because of inherent characteristic, which is known as motility. But stomach is much more than a simple organ for digestion. It is in fact a highly sophisticated neuroendocrine organ with its functions and physiology that go beyond digestion and impact even systemic conditions. Interestingly, if you understand the structure, it consists of a very some of the very intricately positioned cells, some of which are, for instance, the entire stomach is lined by a mucus, which is a protective layer, which is secreted by the mucus cells. Then the HCl is secreted by the parietal cells, and also the intrinsic factor is secreted by the parietal cells. The parietal cells primarily are stimulated under the influence of gastrin 17, which is secreted by the G cells, which is predominantly present in the antral region of the stomach. And the way it acts is through the enterochromaffin like cells, which release histamine, and histamine stimulates the parietal cells. Also, it directly affects the parietal cells. It directly stimulates gastrin 17, also directly stimulates the parietal cells to release HCl. Now, HCl cleaves pepsinogen. Pepsinogens are precursors for pepsin. Those are zymogens, which are released by chief cells. And this release of HCl is a very highly orchestrated and involves a feedback mechanisms where two major hormones are involved. One is gastrin 17 and the other is somatostatin. Interestingly, as the entire secretory function goes on, there is another important function which is critical to digestion, which is nothing but motility. Now, the motility part depends on cells which are called as interstitial cells of Cajals, which are the gastric pacemakers, and they are situated, primarily the gastric pacemakers are in the corpus region. So beyond this digestion, interestingly, stomach is also an organ where you find some very important hormones that are secreted, such as leptin, ghrelin, obestatin, somatostatin, gastrin 17, which we already have seen right now, and most importantly, serotonin. In fact, 80 to 90% of serotonin in our body is released through gut, and the major component coming from stomach through the serotonin producing cells, which are in the gastric corpus regions. The stomach, interestingly, I would like to believe and say so that it is the most neglected organ because it is able to take enormous insults and assaults through its lifetime. And how is it commonly afflicted? The damaging factors being probably systemic diseases, overuse of some medications, our lifestyle habits, toxic foods, alcohol, then cigarette smoking, tobacco basically. But the most notorious of all is what we know as H. pylori. And this H. pylori, if once it finds a favorable conditions to grow, it proliferates and just induces some unwanted changes in the stomach mucosa, probably inflammation and atrophy. And this disrupts the overall functionality of the stomach, wherein there are changes in the mucosa, but also because of systemic disease, overuse of medications, our habit, our genetic predispositions, there could be a disruption in the normal physiology of the stomach. And once that happens, all these enzymes and hormones are disrupted, leading to abnormal stomach mucosa, primarily which leads to stomach dysfunction, or in fact, going beyond stomach, it is gastroduodenal dysfunction that we are talking of. And all this alteration in the stomach mucosa probably results in changes which absolutely alter the secretory pattern of the stomach, and which the H. pylori infection compounds it, which influences the stomach function, thereby leading to a disruption in normal physiology, which is digestion, motility, and regulation of key metabolic processes. The disruption is the basis of not only gastric disorders, predominantly the gastric disorder is dyspepsia, but also it results in it forms a pathophysiological basis for even extragastric disorders like obesity, diabetes, NASH, asthma, atherosclerosis, and so on. And most importantly, inherently, these changes in time will lead to GI cancers. So it is very important to understand and assess the stomach health, the stomach function, because obviously early diagnosis will lead to better treatment options, and thus health assessment and stomach function assessment of the stomach becomes of paramount importance. And as we all know, we'll see in the next slide actually how the stomach is really capable of having an influence on extra gastric disorders as well. But stomach truly is a gateway to health and disease. Even a traditional knowledge base has the sum set up in a beautiful slok called as Tadetat Strudasam Prakrutir Bhutatvat Na Vikarahi Upasrujjate Shariram. Meaning as long as the channel, and mind well, the digestive system is called as the Mahasrotasa. As long as the Mahasrotasa is in normal function, you can rest assured not only that the digestive tract, but in fact all the systems will be in good health and free of disease. Thus, it is important to use some crucial biomarkers to assess whether the stomach is in diseased or in a healthy state. Why? Because the changes in the serological levels of these biomarkers do nothing but they reflect changes which tell us about the functional capacity of the stomach mucosa. Any abnormality of these biomarkers indicates failures of feedback mechanisms which are responsible for controlling the secretions of the stomach. Thus, disruption of this homeostasis will nothing but increase the allostatic load, and the most common presentation of which is in clinical practice is dyspepsia, which obviously needs to be dealt with caution. Though in day-to-day practice, it becomes crucial to understand the status of stomach mucosa, and on a clinician or physician level, there is no powerful tool primarily to assess this condition of the stomach apart from that H. pylori test. Obviously, gastroenterologists are at a privilege to use their endoscopes to understand structural changes that are there, but the underlying functional change that bring about those structural change are more important and need to be understood very early on in the disease pathogenesis process. Thus, I believe that we are trying to explore, that is the reason why we are here. We are going to try to explore non-endoscopic and try to assess whether a non-endoscopic assessment of stomach health is possible. And thus, I would hand over the session now to Dr. VGM Mohan Prasad. He is a very famous gastroenterologist from Coimbatore, and he'll be talking with us on recent advances in non-invasive diagnosis of stomach diseases and associated risks. Before I introduce him, I would like to ask all the participants to, if at all they have any questions, feel free to punch in those in the message box. We'll try to address those post-session. Yeah, over to you, Dr. VGM, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Ajit, who's the director of GastroLab, and also good evening to Dr. Himanshu from LALPATH. I thank GastroLab, Dr. Ajit, and also Mr. Jagdeep and LALPATH for inviting me to deliver this talk today on a very interesting subject, a non-invasive serologic diagnostic test. We have all the time as gastroenterologists looking at the stomach structure through endoscopy, but we have no tool to assess the gastric function test. This is similar to doing a liver function test biochemically versus doing a ultrasound or shear wave elastography or a fibroscan transient elastography to assess the structure of the liver. We have always been looking at the structure of the stomach, but not the function. And stomach is such a complex organ. And Dr. Ajit gave a beautiful intro as to all the hormones that are there. And I will just take you now through the serological tests of gastric function. So how important they are and how can we adapt them into a clinical practice. So I'll give you a brief about the background, which Dr. Ajit has spoken in detail, but I'll also reiterate some of the points. Introduce you to the GI disorders where assessing the stomach health might be of importance. And then also an approach to the GI disorders and dyspepsia and the diagnostic dilemma and the solution. And how can we use the GastroPanel in our day-to-day clinical practice. The stomach is a gateway to health and disease. It was beautifully highlighted by the previous speaker. So over a lifetime, it takes so many insults because we don't care for the stomach like we care for the heart or care for the brain. Many people are brainless in the world, so at least we have a brain to think and use, but we don't bother about the stomach. We take it for granted. And in fact, stomach, is a very special organ. My own teacher, Dr. N. Madana Gopalan, who was the father of medical gastroenterology for whole South, used to ask this question: which is the most wonderful organ in the human body? People will say heart, people will say brain, people will say something else, liver, but he'll say, no, it is the stomach. He used to also justify, he used to say that stomach is the one that secretes acid that goes down to the pH of 1. This is strong acid, such strong hydrochloric acid that it can, even you put in a nail, it can melt. But it still doesn't digest itself. And immediately after the stomach is the duodenum, which can never withstand the acid load. And up on top is the esophagus, which cannot withstand the acid load. So how nature has created such a beautiful compartment, because acid is so important for digestion and for preventing infections, bacteria, fungi, all are destroyed, viruses are destroyed by the stomach acid. So acid is a friend and the foe. So we need to know more about it and more about the stomach. How can we know more about the functions of the stomach so that we can protect the stomach and the patient? Because stomach is a gateway to health and disease, because a stomach dysfunction can lead to systemic disorders which can affect the heart, brain, liver, and lungs. So we need to do timely diagnosis in order to effectively treat and protect the human body. Right. So diagnosing stomach diseases, it's always time immemorial. It has been endoscopy. So because right from Kussmaul endoscopy, which was about 100 and odd years back, so he used to pass rigid endoscope inside, to the flexible ones which came in late 50s. It's about almost like 60, 70 years. And we always depend on endoscopy to look into the stomach. But endoscopy procedure itself is expensive. And it also depends upon the resolution of the endoscope. The better the resolution, the better the magnification, the better the pickup of the lesions. So, and most of the centers have low-end machines which cannot detect early changes properly. So this is very important. I'll just show you. And also not everybody can undergo endoscopy except for in tertiary care centers or in endoscopy available centers. So at a primary level, how do you diagnose gastric dysfunction? It's just basically it's symptom based, and it involves trial therapies, which are probably not the right thing to do. Look at this endoscope. This is 190 series, which is one of the highest ends of Olympus. And this is white light endoscopy. And here they have changed the bandwidth to a narrow band imaging. You see here, you see this area? This is not a normal area. In a normal endoscope, this will look like a small red patch or may not even be detected. But this is an area of dysplasia of the stomach. You come to this slide, the next slide I'll show you. See this. This is in the fundus. You see this red spot? You will think, oh, it is just a simple erythema. It's not true. This is the demarcation of a normal mucosa. This is abnormal area. See the magnification here. You see the capillary loops, and this is abnormal vessels here. Usually the capillaries go around the pits. This is the regular pattern. See here the abnormal vessels. See here. This is abnormal. And you see further magnification and chromoendoscopy, even just the NBI clearly demarcates a normal mucosa from an abnormal area. And endoscopic submucosal dissection of this lesion was done, which shows this is carcinoma of stomach. This is early gastric cancer. And if you miss it, it's a problem. You see in the previous one, this patient has an atrophic gastritis and he is developing dysplasia. And the next step, it will go to adenocarcinoma. So we need to break this by properly diagnosing problems. Atrophic gastritis has to be diagnosed early so that we can prevent the patient from getting into pre-neoplastic and then neoplastic conditions. If you look at all GI disorders, we can divide basically into 3 clinical domains. These are clinical domains. One set is organic disorders, where if you do the test, you will find something abnormal. So this is depending on the gastrointestinal integrity. Here, there are what are called functional disorders, where, like structurally, by doing all the tests, you cannot find anything. And these functional disorders definitely interfere, hamper the digestion process in the body. And then superimposed to this group is a dysmotility disorder, where motility of the GI tract is affected. And these 3 entities, even though clinically, you call them 3 different entities clinically, but they are not watertight compartment. They always overlap with each other. So please remember, one patient may have an organic disorder along with dysmotility and a functional disorder. And these are the overlap zones. So you have to remember and try to understand the problem. Like examples are organ changes happen in atrophic gastritis, esophagitis, ulcers, polyps, cancers, and in the lower GI tract inflammatory bowel disease, which even Crohn's gastritis has been well recognized. If you look at the organ function, functional dyspepsia is one of the major problems today. If you see all dyspeptics, 100 dyspepsia patients in the clinic, which we gastroenterologists do, which I have been seeing for the past 33 years of my GI practice, you see that organic association is very small percentage, maybe about 20 to 30%, 70%. There is no organic basis. At least with the available tools, we cannot define an organic cause. So these, with the dyspepsia where you cannot define an organic cause, is called a functional dyspepsia. And the Rome, is divided into 2 types. One is the epigastric pain syndrome, which typically resembles an ulcer disease, but you do an endoscopy, you don't see an ulcer. The other component is a postprandial distress syndrome, the PDS. There, after food, the patient, feels heavy and bloated until the food leaves the stomach. So then you have irritable bowel syndrome, you have functional constipation, you have GERD, and then functional or chronic diarrhea. All these could be functional. And then you have, motility disorders, which can also produce a lot of discomfort, gastroparesis, diffuse esophageal spasm, intestinal pseudo-obstruction, colonic inertia, and likewise. But we're not looking at the lower GI tract at this point of time. We're looking only at the upper GI tract here. Okay, so majority of the upper GI disorders, which are common in clinical practice, are functional or motility disorders rather than organic. They don't have an organic basis. And if you see here, the functional gastrointestinal disorders affect the quality of life. Not that everybody has to have an organic basis in order to suffer. People suffer without any organic disease, and people, remember, come to the doctors not with the diagnosis, not for getting their disease diagnosed, but for symptom relief. they come to you with pain or dyspepsia, gas trouble, bloating or whatever, we need to find out and treat them. So these functional gastrointestinal disorders have a complex biopsychosocial etiologic basis. And the gut-brain interaction is very important here. And one classic example is IBS, where there is altered motility, visceral hypersensitivity, immune dysregulation, there is inflammatory changes and barrier dysfunction. The gut mucosal barrier is broken here. Altered microbiota, central nervous and enteric nervous system disturbance. All this could form a part of the gut-brain interaction disturbance. So every individual has a different clinical phenotype, paving way for several variations. So there's always an overlap. For example, if somebody presents with dyspepsia, it may not be all the time from the stomach. It may be a gastroduodenal dysfunction or sometimes even pancreatic dysfunction. It could be gallbladder dysfunction. So gallbladder dysfunction can also present similarly with heartburn, regurg, belching, flatulence, epigastralgia, abdominal pain, indigestion, postprandial fullness, early satiety, nausea, vomiting, chronic diarrhea. I'm sure all of you recognize this is very, very common in our clinical practice. So I told you about the EPS, epigastric pain syndrome, and the postprandial distress syndrome. All this can present this way. So they're all functional. So how do we sort this out? The first thing, like simple thing, like you do an ultrasound, then gallbladder, if there are gallstones or thick-walled gallbladder or non-functional gallbladder, all those will indicate that the dyspepsia is coming from gallbladder. And if somebody has, evidence of chronic pancreatitis, then it's obviously a pancreatic dysfunction or acute pancreatitis. Otherwise, it is a gastroduodenal dysfunction that we are looking at. So these are two important symptoms that I consider in my clinical practice. These are by far the commonest in my clinical practice, the dyspepsia and GERD. Apart from that is IBS, pancreas dysfunction, celiac disease, lactose intolerance we see in the Asiatic population, gastroenteritis, inflammatory bowel disease, and bile acid diarrhea. All this could happen. And Thompson published in Gut in 2000 that, if you see here, the IBS 29%, gastroenteritis and IBD have an organic basis, whereas starting from IBS to functional disease, dyspepsia, GERD, many a time they don't have anything solid. Like even GERD, you do an endoscopy. How many times do you see mucosal breaks? How many times do you see, evidence for reflux? You don't. So majority of the situation, you don't see anything. So by and large, these are called functional disorders. So how do you find the, solution for these? It's just not the endoscopy. I'm just coming to show you how there are other things like gastric function tests which can be of help. If you see here, 30% of patients in general practice have dyspepsia. Even in Mumbai, 30% of the population have dyspepsia. IBS among dyspeptics is seen in 13 to 29%. Functional dyspepsia among IBS is 29 to 87%. There's so much of overlap between GERD, dyspepsia, that's a functional dyspepsia, both the PDS and EPS and IBS. Celiac is on the rise, exocrine pancreatic insufficiency may be there in chronic pancreatitis, and so many things come under the basket of dyspepsia. So if you see a dyspeptic patient, you are baffled, you don't know what you're treating. It's just not putting them on PPIs or some digestive enzyme and sending them home. That will never solve the problem. So we need to work up more. And today it's possible to work up more even in the primary care setting. That is why we are discussing this topic today. So the approach to management of dyspepsia erstwhile has always been endoscopy, has been on the forefront. So any uninvestigated dyspepsia, after excluding the drug history, giving an empirical therapy, test and treat for H. pylori, or give a PPI empirical therapy or add a prokinetic agent and see what happens. This is just an empirical therapy. Then, if you ruled out organic, this is just divided into two types. One is organic and the functional. So once you rule out organic through endoscopy, it all goes under functional. Then what do? We just treat according to the symptom of the patient. We don't even know what is exactly happening inside. The patient asks you a question, sir, what is wrong with me? You did endoscopy, there's nothing. And you say, no, there's nothing wrong with you. But why am I like this? I don't know. Maybe you'll give a letter to the psychiatrist, but the patient will throw it into the garbage and go to another gastroenterologist. So this is what happens. And many a times people are dissatisfied with the treatment of dyspepsia. So they self-medicate themselves, they buy drugs, OTC, over the counter, and this can create a lot of trouble, lot of problems. Delay the diagnosis, can land them in dangerous, hazardous situations. And in the primary care, general practitioner treats the patient based on his symptoms because the test accessibility is poorer in the primary care, except for H. pylori serology, which can be done in the as an office test. Otherwise, these sort of empirical treatments delay the diagnosis, delay the referral to the gastroenterologist, land the patient in trouble. So, diagnostic dilemma in dyspeptic patients. This is if you take all 100 cases of uninvestigated dyspepsia, the questions in the back of your mind: is it functional dyspepsia? Could it be IBS? Could it be a motility disorder? Could it be GERD or functional heartburn? Functional heartburn is one where you do an endoscopy, you don't find any changes, but the patient has heartburn. You do an impedance pHmetry, you're not able to demonstrate hyperacidic reflux. So, but still the patient has heartburn. This is called a functional heartburn. This comes under Rome criteria of functional, disorders. There is a non-cardiac chest pain. Patients coming with pain, but heart is normal. Gallbladder dysfunction, altered motility, only as dyspepsia. And the dyspepsia completely clears. Even ureteric calculus obstruction presents as dyspepsia, which gets cleared after the obstruction goes. So the body is very complex. We don't understand. So unless we investigate more, we'll never get the answer. Then as this H. pylori, which is there freely supplied by our corporation water supply in India and probably in many third world countries. And then this can produce gastritis because H. pylori, once it enters, it can stay in the system for 30 long years. It has been classified as class 1 carcinogen by WHO. And then there is what is called a non-H. pylori gastritis. For so many reasons it can happen, right from non-steroidal drugs to alcohol to smoking to whatever. And then you have the atrophic gastritis, which is the major problem. This has been put into red box because this can lead to malignancy. So we need to really bother about it. So a study of clinico-endoscopic profile of patients presenting with dyspepsia was done in India, and they showed that in the majority, in 54, they found a normal stomach. And then erosive gastroduodenitis was seen in a smaller proportion. And then peptic ulcer, esophagitis, upper GI malignancy, candidiasis, esophagus, all that. But if you see here, so majority are males and lesser are females because males go to the doctors more often. They are clinical help seekers, whereas the females don't get to go. But nevertheless, please remember, majority of the instances, endoscopy in dyspepsia is going to be negative. We cannot find out the cause. Right. So we have to go for a non-invasive diagnosis. So what is that? That is a gastropanel. So what can the gastropanel do? There's a first-line diagnostic test of functional dyspepsia that has come into India, and also it's very much popular in Europe and other countries, but it's just come into India since a few years now. And then, it's the first test for first-line diagnostic test for functional dyspepsia for segregation of different subtypes, and also for screening for the stomach cancer. So it can be useful in functional dyspepsia, even in GERD or acid dysfunction, H. pylori induced or non-H. pylori induced gastritis, and also atrophy of the stomach, the atrophic gastritis, all can be diagnosed by gastropanel. So we will see what these functional tests are. So, and how do you apply in the clinical practice? So, if you see the dyspepsia, the gastropanel, the uninvestigated dyspepsia, so you can either do an endoscopy or gastropanel or both. I would think probably both will be good. And if you're sitting in a primary care center, gastropanel probably. After ruling out a drug-induced the drug-induced gastritis and also H. pylori, so then empirical treatment. So once you classify into organic or functional, then the gastropanel can, in association with the endoscopy, can increase the diagnostic yield of stomach diseases. I told you time and again, dyspepsia, you do endoscopy, majority of the time, 70% of the times you do not pick up anything. Then what answer do you give to your patient? On the other hand, if you combine with gastropanel, then the yield becomes better. So it's both a screening, diagnostic, prognostic, and therapeutic tool in order to assess the stomach health and function. So this is a serological biopsy. So this is a 4-hour blood sample which is taken in dyspeptics. It's only a serological test which can differentiate a normal from abnormal mucosa. If you see here, if you look at the gastric structure, there are 2 valves. One is the pylorus, the other one is the lower-esophageal sphincter, and then is the stomach. The most intriguing factor here is that the pylorus acts as a sieve, but it looks like a hollow organ, like a hole. It just looks like a black hole when you do endoscopy. There is no sieve. It doesn't have any sieve structure, but it will not allow particles above a particular size to go through. That is nature's creation. What a great wonder. I told you, this organ cannot take acid, this organ cannot take acid. Whereas here is acid to a pH of 1, which will digest even a nail. So this is the most crucial thing. And there in the stomach, the cell types are the goblet cells, which produce mucus, which protects. The mucus forms the top layer of the gastric mucosal barrier, which prevents the pathogens from coming close to the epithelial cells, which prevents acid and pepsin from corroding and damaging the epithelial cells. So goblet cells secrete mucin and mucus and also bicarbonates, which keep the local environment, non-acidic. And the H. pylori, is like an Indian politician. It knows how to survive even in the high acid environment. No other bacteria can survive. This will go and stay in the, mucus bicarbonate layer of the upper portion of the stomach, and then try to get into the epithelial cell and start getting in deeper into the pits. So parietal cells produce gastric acid. The chief cells produce pepsinogen. The D cells produce somatostatin. The G cells produce gastrin. These are all the important hormones that we are now today looking at. And our previous speaker, Dr. Ajit, spoke about various other hormones which are involved in, hunger and satiety and all that, and motility. I'm not looking at all that. So this is the gastric pit. This is, this is a fundic corpus region. This is the antral region. The antral region of the stomach have the G cells. The G cells are the ones which produce gastrin. On the other hand, the fundic corporal cells, they have different types of cells. The parietal cells are here. The G cells are here. So as the food goes down, I'll show you the loop, how it works. So, but this is a parietal cell which secretes the acid. This is called the proton pump. And it is called, the final common pathway is a proton pump, the hydrogen potassium ATPase, which secretes acid, hydrogen ions. It gets stimulated by 4 receptors. 3 receptors are stimulant, 1 receptor is inhibitory, blocking. So the inhibitory one is the somatostatin receptor. Whereas those which stimulate the parietal cell, the acetylcholine, the cholinergic receptor, then you have the gastrin receptor, and you have the histamine receptor. So what happens is there's a feedback loop I'll show you. So whenever acid is secreted, see the G cell stimulates the parietal cell to produce acid, and the acid goes and inhibits the D cell. Stimulates the D cell to produce somatostatin, which inhibits the G cell. This is to prevent unabated acid production by the stomach. So here, the gastrin also stimulates the enterochromaffin-like cell, which produces histamine. So this is where the H2 blockers block this area, and the proton pumps block this area. Okay, so we'll just move on to see this about gastrin 17 also. See this. This is the loop that I told you. The G cells are in the antrum, and once the food comes into the stomach, it stimulates the G cell to produce gastrin. The gastrin is an endocrine cell. So the gastrin goes through the blood vessel and goes and attaches. It's got more affinity to the enterochromaffin-like cell than even the parietal cell, but it binds the parietal cell and also enterochromaffin cell-like cell. So histamine is secreted. This goes and stimulates the parietal cell, apart from the cholinergic stimulus, which I have not shown here. So the parietal cell produces acid, and the acid goes down and stimulates the D cell in the antrum, which secretes the somatostatin. Somatostatin is a switch off hormone in the GI tract. So it just switches off the G cell. So the G cell will not produce any more gastrin. So the stomach says, okay, enough of acid. I want to stop here. When I need acid, G cells produce gastrin. When I need to switch off, the D cells produce somatostatin to switch off. So this is what happens. When food comes down, it makes the G cells in the antrum to produce G17. So this G17 goes and stimulates the parietal cell to produce hydrochloric acid. Once the hydrochloric acid is high and the pH goes down, this goes and inhibits the production of gastrin. So this is a negative pH. So it's a positive feedback and negative feedback mechanisms in the stomach to protect itself. So we are in this gastro panel, we are looking at 4 things. 1, don't think I'm talking about anasin, but this is the 4 things that we are looking at. 1 is pepsinogen, 2, the gastrin 17, and then the H. pylori IgG. The pepsinogen 1 is produced by the chief cells, so the oxyntic cells in the corpus region. And what do they reveal? The functionality of the parietal cells and chief cells correlates with the maximal acid output. So in order to have normal pepsinogen 1, the chief cells or the oxyntic cells have to be intact. If they are damaged, then the pepsinogen levels will go down. And you see the pepsinogen, this is in the corpus region, pepsinogen 1, the body here. Whereas the pepsinogen 2 is produced by the entire stomach. Okay, so these can be affected by the inflamed mucosa, then the pepsinogen 2 can go down. Then the gastrin 17 is from the antral G cells. So once the antral G cells are disordered, gastrin 17 secretion will go down. So also the lower the gastrin 17, then it can promote more reflux into the esophagus. So G17 is a marker of acid reflux, acid dysfunction, and antral mucosa function because it's produced from the antrum. If G17 is intact, antrum is intact. H. pylori, that is expressed IgG antibody, expressed against H. pylori by the human body as an immunological memory. So it shows the status of H. pylori infection. So the pepsinogen 1 is measured in micrograms and it shows the functionality of the parietal cells and chief cells because obviously the chief cells produce pepsinogen 1 and the pepsinogen 1 has to be cleaved to the active pepsin moiety by acid. So if acid has to be there, parietal cells have to be intact. So that is what it shows. So these are zymogens. Pepsinogens are zymogens which are converted to pepsin in the presence of acid at a higher pH. Right. Next, pepsinogen 2. This is an inflammation marker. Normally, the pepsinogen 1 is 30 to 60 microgram. This is produced from the corpus, I said. Pepsinogen 2 is produced by the entire stomach. So these are zymogens which are converted again into pepsin by the action of acid, and the normal range is lower at 3 to 15 microgram per liter. So H. pylori is measured in the way of 30 international units. That is a IgG antibody titer. So this is 30 international units. So we used to, have laboratory standardization in 1994 when I started finding out the use of IgG antibodies in H. pylori. We found that our cutoff was 12, but here they have taken the cutoff as 30, which has been tested for this kit in Europe. So anything below 30 says no H. pylori infection likely. Anything above 30 could be an active infection or a recently treated H. pylori infection, right? So the G17, which is a gastrin, which is a hormone. So the previous one was a zymogen, which is an enzyme, the pepsinogen 1 and 2. This is a hormone, and the hormone is produced from the antral G cells. As you see here, the gastrin, the length of the gastrin is there's a pregastrin and then gastrin 34, 17, and 14, out of which the 17 is active moiety. So the reduced gastrin 17 may mean the acid secretion of this is not secretion status of the stomach. Hypersecretory state, the G17 is low because acid inhibits the production of gastrin. And also it could mean patient might have reflux disease. I don't know whether it is working. This video is not working. So I'll just move to the next. So the low G17 causes relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter, and acid can surge upwards into the esophagus. So that has been well proven in studies. So the normal range is between 1 and 7 picomole per ml. So it's very, very negligent level you can detect in the blood. So the gastro panel in the clinical management, how do we do that? This is the most important slide that I would think. So if you see here, the first one is the pepsinogen 1, pepsinogen 2. This is the PG1, PG2 ratio, gastrin 17, gastrin 17B and 17S, and then the H. pylori IgG antibody. The first one, pepsinogen 1 is normal, 2 is normal, ratio is normal, gastrin is normal, so B and 17B, 17S all are normal, and H. pylori antibody is below 30. That means healthy mucosa, no atrophy, no H. pylori infection. On the other hand, if pepsinogen 1 is normal, 2 is normal, ratio is normal, gastrin is low. Here the gastrin 17S is normal, but 17B is low, and then antibody is negative. This is a high acid output in the corpus. This shows that in the corpus there is a high acid output. Here the pepsinogen 1 is normal or high, and the ratio is normal, and gastrin 17B is high, and the others are normal. 17S and H. pylori are normal. This indicates that it's a healthy mucosa but a low acid output. Probably the patient is taking proton pump inhibitors chronically. You have another option here where the pepsinogen 1 is normal or high, 2 is normal or high, pepsinogen 1-2 ratio is normal, gastrin is normal or high, and 17S is not important, so not detected here. So this is antibody is normal or high. It could mean that there could be an active infection, not treated, but nevertheless, there is no problem here. Whereas here, if you see, here there's a H. pylori antibody is high. That means it's an active infection. Sorry, the previous one, correct, yeah. And this antibody is high here, but all the rest are normal. That infection has been eradicated. And the antibody titers take 12 to 24 months before they settle down. So that is why the screening tests for H. pylori can be serological. But post-eradication, if you want to ensure that the H. pylori is gone or not, a quantitative titer might help. Or more than that, we have to rely upon a urea breath test, which is a gold standard, or an endoscopic biopsy has to be done in order to confirm eradication of H. pylori, because this serological test will take 6 months, 12 months, and 24 months to completely go down to normal once there is an active IgG antibody production because of H. pylori infection, even after the eradication. Right. So here you see the other scenario where pepsinogen 1 is normal, 2 is high, ratio here is normal, so gastrin is high. So pepsinogen 2 is high, gastrin is high, and H. pylori could also be high. Here the H. pylori is still there, the eradication has failed because there is still a problem going on here. Likewise, atrophic gastritis in the corpus can be diagnosed here by low gastrin 17B and low gastrin 17, yes. And the H. pylori could also produce a corpus atrophy. So as we know in the long run. So the other scenario is atrophic gastritis involving both the corpus and antrum, pan atrophy of the stomach. If you see here, pepsinogen 1 is low, 2 is low, ratio is low, gastrin is low, and then gastrin 17B, 17S both are low. And then this H. pylori may be normal or high because high serology indicates that its pan-gastric atrophy is produced by the H. pylori. So once you eradicate H. pylori, then this atrophy can improve. In non-H. pylori gastric atrophy, we really need to bother to follow these guys up and then prevent them getting into intestine and metaplasia, dysplasia, carcinoma sequence. And here, in this scenario, pepsinogen 1 is high, 2 is high, and then the ratio is normal because both are high. Gastrin is high, and then H. pylori is normal. This is a short break in the PPI treatment, which can produce an acid rebound. Once you start the proton pump inhibitors, acid can come back up. All this can be diagnosed by one test, gastropanel test. It's really something I really love, and it's very nice. So let us look at some case scenarios before I close. This is a 40-year-old gentleman who came with dyspeptic symptoms, no heartburn, no flatulence, no history of H. pylori, no non-steroidals, no PPIs. Here you see the pepsinogen is normal, 1 is normal, 2 is normal, ratio is normal, 17B is normal, antibodies are negative. So this is a functional dyspepsia, which is probably with no organic cause, and the stomach is healthy. You have to look for other causes. The next case is a 32-year-old female who came with dyspeptic symptoms with heartburn but relieved after medication. Indigestion, no history of H. pylori infection, continuous use of PPI in this patient, and no use of non-steroidal drugs. Here you see the pepsinogen 1 is normal, 2 is normal, ratio is normal. Because acid is also normal, there is no damage to the pepsinogen cells or the chief cells. On the other hand, the gastrin 17B is high and the H. pylori antibodies are normal. So this indicates there is hypochlorhydria. The less the acid, the more the gastrin. The body is trying to stimulate the parietal cells to produce more acid. That is why it keeps producing more gastrin. So this is hypochlorhydria, very obviously because of PPI use. That is by far the commonest. Then this is a 36-year-old male who came with dyspeptic symptoms with heartburn, chronic cough, not relieved due to routine medication. If you see here, pepsinogen is normal, 1 and 2 ratio, but gastrin is very low, which indicates hyperacidic state. There's so much acid that the gastrin is low. Here again, the H. pylori is normal here. So it's a normal healthy mucosa, low gastrin 17, increased acid secretion, which could also stimulate more reflux. These sort of hyperacidity can lower the LES pressures, transient lower esophageal sphincter relaxations, the TLESRS. They're physiological. The transient relaxation of LES happens physiologically at least 4 times to 6 times in an hour. The acid goes up and comes down because the conduit of esophagus does not have an absorptive surface. So any food or bacteria should be cleared from there. So this nature's protective mechanism to clear the esophagus of debris, pathogens, and food. On the other hand, if there is hyperacidity, there is more reflux, and because of more relaxation of the LES, and this can be easily detected by impedance pHmetry, but nevertheless can also be detected by testing the gastrin 17B, which is low. Here in this case, these pepsinogens are normal, but H. pylori antibodies are very high. 48-year-old male with dyspepsia. So this is H. pylori dyspepsia. Here, this is another dyspeptic male. The same guy who underwent eradication. You see here, previously the titer was 800. Today the titer is 457, which means there is a response to the treatment. But to become normal, it will take 6 months, 12 months, or 24 months. Another scenario where there's a H. pylori is positive here, 144, but pepsinogen 2 is high at 60, whereas the pepsinogen 1 is normal. And this is H. pylori induced gastritis. So that's what it shows, because I told you this is an inflammatory marker, the pepsinogen 2. So it shows that the H. pylori inflammation is there. This is an active infection not treated. Here, pepsinogen 2 is high, 1 is also high. The ratio is normal because both are high. Gastrin is high, indicating low acid output, but nevertheless, this H. pylori is 689 is high, which indicates probably there is some atrophy of the gastric mucosa, especially the antral atrophy can be there because G17 is low and H. pylori is positive. So the culprit is H. pylori and there is an antral atrophy. Once you eradicate H. pylori, the antral atrophy will resolve and the gastrin will again come back to normal. Look at this scenario, 53-year-old lady who's asymptomatic apart from belching and loss of appetite and got anemia, no H. pylori, no PPIs, no non-steroidals, but patient had Hashimoto's disease, Hashimoto's thyroiditis, which is autoimmune thyroiditis. So this lady had a pepsinogen which is low, 1, pepsinogen 2 was normal, 1 was low, and PG1 PG2 ratio was low, gastrin levels were high, 40, so H. pylori antibody is negative. So there is an atrophy of the corpus mucosa. That's why this pepsinogen 1 is low. That means the peptic cells, the chief cells in the corpus are unable to produce pepsinogen because of the atrophy of the mucosa. And G17 is high, indicating the acid, hydrochloric acid is so low that the body is trying to increase the gastrin in order to stimulate the production of acid. So this is atrophic gastritis in the corpus, which is a high risk of developing gastric carcinoma. And 20% of autoimmune thyroiditis may have atrophic gastritis, chronic atrophic gastritis of the corpus. Here the atrophic gastritis of the antrum. Look here, the pepsinogen is normal, 1 and 2 are normal, ratio is normal. But look at the gastric 17B is low and antibodies are positive at 86, which shows the atrophic gastritis of the antrum because the antral G cells are atrophic. They are unable to produce gastrin. This is, and the antibodies are positive. So H. pylori initially lurks in the antrum. So it produces an antral gastritis. Then only it extends to the corpus to produce a pan gastritis. So this is a 59-year-old gentleman who with dyspeptic symptoms like epigastric pain, belching, indigestion, not responding to basic treatment. Why? Because he has got an atrophic gastritis of the antrum because of H. pylori. Once you eradicate it, it will become normal. So the gastro panel corroborates with histopathology. I'll show you one example from my friend's unit from Pune. And see the early screening. See, there's a 63-year-old real-life patient with dyspepsia, flatulence, acidic symptoms, continues to use PPI, no known history of H. pylori here. But you see the panel, pepsinogen 1 is 70, which is normal. Pepsinogen 2 is 2, which is slightly low. PG1, PG2 ratio is high at 33. Gastrin 17B is low at 1. H. pylori antibody is 693. So this indicates that there is an antral atrophy because of chronic H. pylori infection of the antrum. So once you eradicate this, then everything will resolve. And they also went ahead and did biopsies. Histopathology showed that chronic H. pylori associated chronic active antral gastritis with mild to moderate atrophy. And then there is a chronic inflammation. So no dysplasia, no malignancy, no intestinal metaplasia. So by the gastro panel, they also had done the CLO test, which was again positive. So all this go to indicate that we can easily diagnose even without endoscopy, even without serology tests separately for H. pylori. If you do a gastro panel, you can just entirely understand the health of the stomach. How is the corpus? How is the antrum? How is the whole body of the stomach? So inflammation of the gastric mucosa is determined by the PG2 levels. H. pylori infection by IgG antibody. Gastric acid secretion, to find out if it is increased, then the low G17 or high G17, which means the acid is low, acid production is low. Atrophy of the stomach is shown by PG1, PG2 ratio of less than 3 or PG1 alone of less than 30. Antral atrophy, if gastrin is 17 is below 1 picomole per liter. Pan atrophy, PG1, PG2 ratio is below 3. PG1 is also low, below 30. And then G17 is also low. Pan atrophy. Reflux, GERD hyperacidity could mean, could have a low G17, which is below 1 picomole per liter. So we can find out the root cause of even extraesophageal symptoms. You see, about 12 disorders can happen when acid refluxes into the esophagus and gets outside the boundary of esophagus. Right from sinusitis, bronchial asthma, dental erosions, dental enamel loss, oral ulceration, then bronchitis, bronchial asthma, chronic lung fibrosis, laryngitis, even laryngeal carcinoma, laryngopharyngeal carcinoma. It can even produce vertigo and tinnitus when acid gets into the eustachian tubes. So acid can produce so much, even globus hystericus, chronic cough, all this can be manifestations of acid reflux, which can happen in GERD and especially in hyperacidic state. So you can easily assess most of the situation, even extraesophageal symptoms, are they related to the stomach, can be ascertained. And definitely in high-risk families of gastric cancer or chronic smokers, all these people definitely require an assessment of risk of stomach cancer, which I'm sure, except for a high resolution magnification zoom endoscopy with chroma endoscopy, it is not possible to diagnose, whereas GastroPanel can easily do it as an office procedure. So GastroPanel, normal prostaglandin, normal G17, normal IgG, H. pylori antibodies, normal stomach. The PGs are normal, that's a pepsinogen is normal, G17 is low, H. pylori negative. This is low acid output. High acid output. Here, the PG2 is high, that's a pepsinogen 2 is high, gastrin 17 is high, H. pylori antibody is positive. This is H. pylori related gastritis, but if it has been eradicated, it could be non-H. pylori eradicated, non-H. pylori gastritis. So here, the prostaglandin, the pepsinogen 1 and 2 are low, pepsinogen 1-2 ratio is low, and variable G17, negative H. pylori is chronic atrophic gastritis. This is put in red because this is the most crucial thing for following these individuals to prevent a cancer of the stomach, right? So if a dyspeptic patient is there, you can classify them as atrophic gastritis, H. pylori gastritis, acid dysfunction, high output, low output, or a normal healthy mucosa using this GastroPanel test. So H. pylori, we need to know, is it associated with inflammation only, or is it associated with atrophy? Because atrophy is more dangerous. So that also can be determined by not only just the serology of H. pylori, but combining with the pepsinogen 1 and 2 gastrin, we can determine. So who should be screened for with the GastroPanel? Patients with dyspepsia and hyperacidity, indigestion, flatulence, gastric pain, and discomfort, history of H. pylori in the past, reflux disease, autoimmune disorders like thyroiditis, diabetes type 1, and IBD, IBS, and celiac disease little lower down on the list. But nevertheless, some of them may have an association. So the benefits of GastroPanel are fourfold. One is identify subjects with a healthy stomach and functional dyspepsia, identifies a patient with acid dysfunction and risk of malnutrition, segregate, that's in low acid, the B12 is low, and all malabsorption, calcium, everything, like vitamin B12, everything can be malabsorbed. So they can have vitamin D, everything can go into a malnourished state if the acid secretion is low. So segregates patients with H. pylori gastritis and non-H. pylori gastritis, detects patients at increased risk of cancer, ulcer, or atrophic gastritis. So patients of dyspepsia, GastroPanel, you can divide into healthy stomach or something wrong with the stomach. Okay, so it's a cost-effective methodology. I'm sure Dr. Himanshu is going to speak about this, but nevertheless, lot of studies globally, 200,000 patients have been worldwide examined on the GastroPanel, but different clinical trials, all published. These are all scientific, well-documented data. You see a sensitivity of 93%, specificity of 95%, accuracy of 94%, positive predictive value of 92%, and negative predictive value of nearing 100%. Amazing sensitivity, specificity, accuracy, positive, negative predictive values. I've not seen any tests reaching up to this level in the clinical trials. So it's really heartening to know that we have a good tool in our hands. So to summarize, my friends, this is the world's first non-invasive test for first-line diagnosis of dyspeptic patient. It distinguishes a healthy from an unhealthy stomach, distinguishes patients from normal stomach mucosa, GERD, or non-HP in HP gastritis and chronic atrophic gastritis and dyspepsia, assesses stomach acid secretion. It is hyperacidity or hypoacidity. So in fact, those days, the British period, if somebody has gastric atrophy, hypoacidic, because they used to put in a right tube, aspirate the acid and check. And they found that they used to give hydrochloric acid. I'm talking about my chief's era of 1950s, 60s early 70s, hydrochloric acid used to be mixed with water and given to the patients. Patients with gastric atrophy and low acid output used to phenomenally improve. Nowadays, it's forgotten, long forgotten, because my teacher told what he has done as a junior resident or as a beginner in gastroenterology. I still remember those days. I'm talking about 50 years, 60 years back. People used to give hydrochloric acid dissolved in water to drink, and the patients became, the dyspepsia disappeared. So we can easily assess the stomach acid secretion. Is it hyper or hypo? If they are hypo-secretor, I don't think we should add fuel to the fire by giving proton pump inhibitors. Because today the style is, whenever somebody comes with dyspepsia, you don't know the answer, you just prescribe a PPI. Yeah, that's it. That is not the way to treat these patients. And also, most important and the last point is that it can help, assess the risk of predicting a future stomach cancer. So I really thank one and all of you for this patient listening. I thank GastroPanel, GastroLab, and LALPATH for giving me this opportunity. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, sir. Thank you, Dr. BGM, sir. Next up is Dr. Himanshu Mazumdar. He's a senior consultant in the clinical chemistry and biochemical genetics department at Dr. LALPATH Labs. Dr. Himanshu is responsible for validation of various tests related to clinical chemistry and biochemical genetics, and is also involved in research, evaluation, validation at Dr. LALPATH Labs. His areas of interest include maternal serum screening and clinical applications of electrophoresis, immunofixation, as well as HPLC studies. He also has participated in various workshops, and he has delivered various talks as a participant and as a keynote speaker in many CMEs and conferences. I welcome Dr. Himanshu. For his talk, he's going to talk on stomach function test, a laboratory's view. Dr. Himanshu, you are mute. You'll have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. I guess I'm audible now. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Ajit, for such a beautiful introduction. So, GastroPanel or stomach function test, most of the key features, most of the things that we need to know about this test, about the clinical utility, benefits, and how it can complement the existing gold standard of endoscopy has already been talked about and already been covered by my previous speaker. I'll just highlight some key points from a laboratory point of view regarding the testing and like who should be tested and who not, and so on. So gastrointestinal disorders, if we see in clinical practice, around 9% of general practitioners' patients come with one or the other problem of symptoms of gastrointestinal problems. And as per the global data, the prevalence of gastrointestinal disorder in primary care is very high. This data has already been shown. So dyspepsia, GERD being very common among the functional diseases, apart from the organic causes like IBS, IBD, or others. So whenever we come across functional dyspepsia, GERD patients in clinical practice, whenever the clinicians come across such patients or suspect, is there any possibility of atrophic gastritis, maybe enteral atrophy, pan atrophy, or chronic atrophy, which is a very, very dangerous and precancerous condition, or there may be gastritis, may or may not be associated with H. pylori, H. pylori gastritis being the most common in India and other developing countries, underdeveloped countries. If we think about a non-invasive approach from a clinician's or general practitioner's point of view in a setting where endoscopy is not accessible to all, then we can think about GastroPanel or stomach health test. This test, as already described by my previous speaker, comprises of basically 4 biomarkers: pepsinogen 1, pepsinogen 2, gastrin 17, and H. pylori IgG antibodies. Pepsinogen 1 is basically related to gastric acid secretion, mainly secreted by the chief cells and parietal cells. It correlates and gives us an idea about the gastric acid secretion. Pepsinogen 2, as we all know, is a marker of inflammation. Gastrin 17 has a positive and a negative feedback mechanism over gastric acid secretion. So it can help us to know about acid dysfunction and reflux diseases. And H. pylori IgG antibodies, we all know, historically used as a serological marker for recent or ongoing H. pylori infection. So who should be screened? Like the patients. So these all have already been covered. I'm just repeating it because these are the highlights of this entire presentation. These are the key points that we should remember as a take-home message, that whenever we come across a patient, maybe in clinical practice or maybe as a lab person or maybe as a healthcare provider, anyone known to us or anybody who seeks help and come up with these sort of symptoms like dyspepsia, hyperacidity, patients with autoimmune disease, patient with history of H. pylori infection, patient with reflux diseases, those should be screened with gastropanel or stomach function test, stomach health test, to know whether the stomach is actually healthy or diseased, what is the condition of the acid secretion, what may be the possible cause of such reflux, and whether there is any atrophy, because as mentioned already many times, chronic atrophic gastritis is a very, very crucial condition. It's a precancerous condition. So this particular panel, this particular test can identify between a healthy and a non-healthy stomach. It identifies the patients who are at risk with acid dysfunction and risk of malnutrition. It also identifies the patient with H. pylori gastritis and non-H. pylori gastritis. It can differentiate based on the H. pylori IgG value and detects the patient who are at risk for development of gastric carcinoma. So the testing protocol, this test we perform, this particular panel, gastro-panel or stomach function test, the methodology is enzyme immunoassay. But a few things we need to remember before we send a sample, we prescribe anyone about the test, like this test should be performed in a fasting condition. The patient should be in a fasting condition before giving the samples for at least 10 hours, if not possible also for at least 4 to 5 hours. Patient should avoid smoking for at least 4 hours prior to sample collection. Patient should avoid following drugs, because we have seen some interpretive reports of stomach function test where every function is normal, but only the gastrin 17 levels are altered, which may be because of chronic use of proton pump inhibitors, H2 receptors, etc. So the patient should avoid these drugs like H2 receptor antagonists, proton pump inhibitors, and antacids. EDTA plasma sample is the preferred sample. The plasma should be separated as soon as possible, preferably within half an hour or within 2 hours. And sample should reach the testing laboratory in a refrigerated or frozen condition so that we can process the sample and give accurate result. Hemolyzed and lipemic samples are generally not accepted. So why stomach health test? It is the first line non-invasive blood test for assessing the stomach health. We all know about endoscopy, which is considered to be gold standard, but if we think of something non-invasive, especially in settings where endoscopy is not available, where patient doesn't have the access to endoscopy, or the price becomes an issue, or invasiveness of the procedure itself becomes an issue, then we have to think of something non-invasive, and this is the stomach health test, or the gastropanel is the recommended first line non-invasive test. It can reliably distinguish between a healthy and diseased stomach, cost-effective, reliable, easily available, and reproducible. It helps to detect those patients who need additional investigations or interventions, and it's a very, very accurate test, which has sensitivity and specificity of around 93 and 95% respectively, positive predictive value of 92.8%, and a negative predictive value of around 100%. So this is the report format from Dr. Lal Path Labs for stomach function test or gastro panel, where we need some history, certain clinical history and drug history from the patient, whether the patient is having any acidic symptom, whether there is a history of using PPI, any history of using NSAIDs, non-steroidal inflammatory drugs, any history of H. pylori eradication. So these histories help us to come to a proper interpretation. Then after processing the sample, we get the levels of the 4 biomarkers, and accordingly, through a designated software, validated software, we can interpret all those values, the levels of all those values, and we can combine with the history provided, and we can come to an interpretive report, whether this patient has a normal healthy stomach, whether there is an acid hypersecretion or hyposecretion, whether there is an antral atrophy, whether there is a pan atrophy, whether the results are suggestive of chronic atrophic gastritis, whether the results are suggestive of recent or ongoing H. pylori infection that can be identified from the value of H. pylori anti-IgG. So this is the report format that we are offering to the patient with this test. And this is the test equation form, basically, where we need these drug histories and clinical histories from the patient. So to summarize, gastropanel or the stomach function test, if we call it by the name, can actually fill many gaps that already were mentioned by Dr. Monsa, can actually fill many gaps where we do not find anything through endoscopy, where the cause is possibly functional, where we want to know what is the etiology, what is the cause, what is going inside the patient's body, and then streamline his treatment and channelize his or her treatment appropriately, rather than giving empirical treatment with PPIs and antacids or enzymes. And also patients, if they come themselves for this test, they can also have an idea about their stomach condition, their acid secretion conditions, because in India, this is a very, very common problem of taking over-the-counter PPIs and antacids and landing up in situations which can be hazardous to the patient. So this test, being a very reliable, very accurate, very specific and sensitive test, being non-invasive, is definitely a very potential test to assess the stomach function, stomach health, and can definitely use along with endoscopy so that we can get better yield in diagnosis of stomach conditions. Thank you. I think now the session is open for questions.
Hello, am I audible?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Sorry. What is the turnaround time for this test, Dr. Himanshu?
Presently, we are doing it once a week, sample by Thursday 9 a.m. and we report it on Friday.
Okay. Wonderful. Perfect. There's a question from Hemant. He's saying that what is the recommendation for patients on chronic aspirin like in CADs? Does that dose of aspirin really hamper the stomach mucosa? Are there any studies to suggest that?
Dr. Hemant, while aspirin has been known to produce gastritis, but it has not been shown to produce a gastric atrophy. So there can be gastritis nevertheless, but it does not alter the acid levels and generally does not produce an atrophy.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
Yes, I think that is what he meant to ask. Dr. Vijayam sir, I just wanted to understand from you, especially this test when it can be used by a lot of general practitioners. What do you think of it being used as a tool for screening routine patients with upper GI problems as a first line test to assess the stomach health status or the stomach function status before initiating any therapy? Because especially in India, where there is a lot of patients who are having reflux, for instance, and doctors give PPI once, and what happens is patients go home and keep taking those PPIs on their own. They really don't come back to the physicians. So that leads to a number of problems, especially we saw in a presentation that the gastrin 17 levels will go high. And in fact, as you know, hypergastrinemia itself initiates a self-proliferative state, and it has been known and attributed as a causative or in the pathophysiology of some of the GI cancers as well. So like in cardiac patients, for instance, or in lipid, wherever there is lipid disruption, most of the times patients going for a lipid profile before initiating a statin, for instance. So what are your thoughts around that of using this test even after, of course, a triage, trying to understand the stomach function and then later on getting into the medication part?
Yeah, that's a complex question, but let me try and answer to the best of my ability. First of all, if a patient comes with dyspepsia of 3 days, 4 days duration, you can just give some empirical therapy and be done away with that. But patients who get recurrent dyspeptic symptoms or chronic dyspepsia patients definitely have to be looked into to see what is happening in them, especially late onset dyspepsia in the elderly. Late onset dyspepsia in the elderly is a pointer that something non-benign could be going on there. We need to really look in. So the first screening test, probably the simplest, easiest, and which is least cumbersome to the patient, is to do a gastropanel test. So probably, like later on, it can also add, LALPATH can also add probably carcinoembryonic antigen also here. And then also probably later on, if, there is a more fanfare, so you can have another subtype with vitamin B12 levels also. So those can be subtypes of this gastropanel test. But nevertheless, the gastropanel is in the primary office setting. It's always wise to use this as a screening tool before injudiciously using PPIs. Today, the proton pump inhibitors, last 2 weeks back, I spoke on PPI stewardship. That is the latest today. How can you step down on the PPIs is what the whole world now is turning around, because the last 2 years has seen a volley of papers, suspecting the role of proton pump inhibitors in very many disorders, starting from AKI, CKD, chronic interstitial nephritis, hypervitaminosis B12, hypervitaminosis D, pathologic fractures, and dementia, and all sorts of things have come in. And what is the worst thing is, chronic profound acid suppression with PPIs can lead to gastric atrophy, and the atrophic gastritis can be a forerunner of gastric carcinoma, adenocarcinoma of stomach coming in. And the worst thing is, if somebody is on chronically on PPIs and has H. pylori, then it makes the whole scenario worse. The H. pylori infection can, because it's a class 1 carcinogen according to WHO,
right?
Especially H. pylori itself can produce atrophic gastritis, and the PPI, chronic prolonged high dose PPI can also produce atrophic gastritis. Both hand in hand clearly, categorically have been shown in clinical studies to increase the risk of adenocarcinoma of the stomach. So if you see the World Gastroenterology Organization, WGO guidelines 2017 are very clear, which say in any patient that you are planning to put the patient on long-term PPI, you should always test and treat for H. pylori. Also, as I told you, dyspepsia can happen even because of hypoacidity, because of gastric atrophy. And what is the role of giving PPIs? So this is just, a wrong way of treating somebody with dyspepsia. So not all dyspepsia, as we showed in the initial slides, dyspepsia may have organic cause and functional cause. It is our, prerogative to rule out all organic causes of dyspepsia, and especially in the elderly, we should rule out malignancy. Like you should know what are all the alarm symptoms. If somebody has anorexia, somebody is losing weight, somebody has vomited blood or has got a melena, somebody has hematemesis, hematochezia, whatever, and then somebody is developing chronic pain. All these patients have probably some organic cause. We should always give priority, especially late onset dyspepsia in the elderly should give you a clue that this is a problematic subtype which has to be investigated. The other subgroup in the GERD, if you take 100 cases of reflux disease, if you do endoscopy, you find 60% of the 65% of the times you don't find any even mucosal breaks, which is called non-erosive reflux disease. It's called NERD. On the other hand, 35% out of 30 of them have erosive reflux esophagitis, which is very dangerous. And another 5% can have complications of GERD. What are the complications? One, it could be a stricture. It could be a Barrett's esophagus, which can, evolve into an adenocarcinoma, or adenocarcinoma itself can be there. All these are complications of GERD. So, if you take 100 cases of GERD, all of them, if you just put them on PPIs, that's again wrong. And as I told you, that there is a big interface and overlap of reflux disease, postprandial distress syndrome, epigastric pain syndrome, irritable bowel syndrome. All these overlap. So, you as a clinician, we need to apply our mind, spend some time with the patient, exactly see how long has it been going on, what is the type of treatment that the patient is on, is there a justification in indefinitely putting them on some empirical therapy. All this has to be checked. If there is some young individual of 20 years who doesn't have too much of problems, short onset dyspepsia, you can treat empirically. So this is very important to understand.
Yeah, I think we're already overshot the time, but one last question, sir. Sorry to hold on to you. How to suspect hypoacidity in patients in primary care setup? Are there any presentations that are commonly seen where?
No, they also present like dyspepsia, and the best thing to do is to do a gastropanel. So you'll find out that hypoacidity from G17 levels will be up, and you can also find out if there is gastric atrophy, which is a cause of hypoacidity, or is it because of PPI. So that can be also found out.
Okay, I think thanks everyone for attending the sessions. A sincere thank to Dr. Lal Path Labs, Dr. Himanshu, and most importantly, Dr. VG Mohan Prasad. It was a pleasure to hear you, sir. And till the next time we are here presenting on topics like this, it's adios from my side. Thanks a lot. Thanks for a wonderful session, sir. Thanks again. Thank you.
Bye. Goodbye to all the viewers.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Himanshu, and also Dr. Ajit.
Yeah.
And thank you, Mohan. Yeah, thank you, Doctor. And thank you, Alka, as well. Alka and Dheeraj.
Oh yeah, Alka and Dheeraj for a very beautiful live streaming without any problems. We have gone through the webinar jam. I know that a lot of people are also on live, also on the YouTube. Where are they, sir? On live?
Facebook,
FB live.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
So greetings to all, and stay safe in this Corona era, because Corona is still there. Don't become lax. Thank you. Bye-bye. God bless. Be safe.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alka.
Thank you, Dr. Ajit.
Thank you, Dr. Himanshu.